Thank you everyone for joining today. I mean, good morning from Barcelona, but I guess good afternoon to everybody else. Thank you for joining us today. My name's Olivia. I'm one of the account managers here at AirDNA, primarily for the Australian markets. I'll be your host this afternoon, where we will be exploring the different sort of short-term rental market trends that we're seeing across the markets in Australia. And to help us explore these insights, we have our two speakers with us today who we've got Sarah Dupree from AirDNA, who probably some of you recognize. She's our lead territory manager for Australia. And then we have Colin Battersby, who is the principal for Discover Stradbroke. And Colin has been a client of ours for a few years now, so he'll be able to give you some valued insights into how AirDNA has helped him over the years. So the layout for today will include a short presentation from both speakers. Please feel free to enter in any questions you might have into the chat box or the Q&A box that you see at the bottom. So there will be a full sort of Q&A session at the end after the presentations, but if you have any sort of burning questions as we go through, we'll be happy to address them as we go as well. So just pop them there on the side and we'll read them out from there. So I'll start by handing over to Sarah. She'll tell you a little bit about how what we do here at AirDNA and exactly how we can benefit, in particular, sort of LGAs, DMOs, tourism boards. So Sarah, go for it.
Awesome. Yeah. So today we'll be kind of diving into what's going on in the short-term rental market in Australia and kind of what the impact has been, as well as future outlook. Just to kind of give you a brief overview of kind of why this is important, and Colin, I'm sure will do a better job than I can of kind of giving you all the dirty details of how he really uses our data. But we are used by many LGAs, tourism boards globally, mostly just to understand what's really going on in the destination. We find that it's often a blind spot and that people are missing. They often have data on hotels or on visitor spend, but when it comes to actually short-term accommodation, which is a rising segment and in many markets can represent up to 50% of the accommodation supply, there's definitely a blind spot. So that's where we come in. Again, here's some of the reasons why you should even care about about short-term rental data and why it's useful for your LGA. So yeah, basically you've got 24 cents of every dollar on lodging spent today globally is through a short-term accommodation rather than what we consider a traditional accommodation. So it's certainly not small in terms of the economic impact. Short-term rental growth prior to COVID, and in some markets we've seen the same sort of growth throughout COVID that have been well positioned, but we're looking at over 300% growth annually in short-term rentals. And then as well, yeah, I mean, 35% of short-term rentals are located in non-traditional destination markets. So these are areas that maybe normally you haven't thought about in terms of tourism promotion. But short-term rentals are located here, which means that visitors are coming. So this is giving us a new opportunity to market different destinations and making it more important than ever in areas that maybe traditionally were more agriculturally focused or focused on conferences and things like that were not as related to tourism. And then important fact, the majority of the short-term rental listings are 2 bedrooms or larger. So it's definitely a completely different sort of segment to traditional hotel inventory, where normally you would have to have multiple rooms. So it is definitely changing the way that people travel and the types of travelers that are choosing this sort of accommodation. And then of course, yeah, 2020 changed this even more throughout the pandemic. So, we see a growing preference for short-term rentals. You've got 60% of leisure travelers now choosing a short-term accommodation over a traditional hotel. A lot of this is due to the way that people travel and the fact that if you're going with a family, it makes more sense to have a place all together than to try and get, multiple rooms in a hotel. As well, short-term rental guests spend more in the destination. So not only do they spend more on their accommodations and they're choosing properties that have a higher nightly rate, but they spend more money in the local destination, going to restaurants, doing different activities. So they are a more valuable guest than the traditional hotel stayer. And then as well, obviously 2020, remote work, longer stays, the STRs, what we've noticed is that basically if your stay is less than 7 days, people are generally fine to stay in a hotel. Once you get past that 7-day mark, the preference for short-term rentals goes way up. And it makes sense. I mean, if you're someplace for longer, you want access to a kitchen, you want some of the comforts of home, even while you're away from home. And the pandemic definitely accelerated some of these trends, with people trying to go to nicer places, get out of the cities, and work remotely from somewhere a bit nicer. And then one of the biggest growing segments in short-term accommodation are what we call unique stays. So these can be things like yurts, tiny houses, yachts. We've seen like school bus renos that have been redone. So there's all kinds of different things. And it turns out that that's one of the main attractions of a short-term accommodation. People want something that is different. And so this can be used as well. We've seen some very successful marketing campaigns just around unique properties that really draw people in addition to all the beauty that many of your destinations have to offer. So how it works, where does our data come from? So we're collecting information from every single listing on Airbnb and Vrbo globally. And then we also have data partnerships. So these data partnerships are with property management systems, large property managers and individual hosts, as well as channel managers who feed into our system and we receive daily reservation data from these sources to then produce fabulous reports for you guys so that you can better understand what's actually going on the short-term rental market. So we ingest everything at the property level, and then we spit it out to give you insights into active listings, seasonality, tax revenue opportunities, which is something I know Colin will probably mention on later, and what an opportunity that is, particularly in the Australian market. So this is how it works and how we ingest the data. So here's a brief agenda for some of the overview of what's going on in the Australian market in particular. So we'll start with recovery with a question mark. There's definitely some bright spots, but certainly I think all of the lockdowns have had a major impact. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. How booking behavior is starting to kind of normalize as the pandemic is hopefully coming to a close and vaccination rates go up. We'll look at changes in supply and then future outlook. So to get us kicked off, in Q2 of 2021, there was an absolute record high for short-term rental bookings globally. And a lot of this is due to some of the pent-up demand, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, where people were willing to travel and needing to travel once the weather got a little bit better. So we'll take a look particularly at what's going on in Australia and Oceania. So Oceania, unfortunately, is lagging behind still in some of that global demand when it comes to recovery. The real winner here, and basically the only one that's almost in positive, has been North America. South America also doing quite well, but Oceania better than Asia, but still has a long way to go in terms of recovery to get back to where it was pre-pandemic. And a lot of this is most likely due to the border closures. Particularly Australia had a massive influence of international tourism, which obviously today is pretty much not possible until the borders are reopened. So in Oceania, the good news is Australia is actually outperforming with the exception of the last 2 months. So Australia has been consistently outperforming the rest of Oceania. The last couple of months, again, it's most likely due to the lockdowns that we've seen, the extended lockdowns again in Sydney and many parts of New South Wales. But things were looking up before then, so somebody's doing something better. When we look into occupancy, again, it's all an impact of some of the lockdowns. So occupancy was actually trailing along pretty nicely, even in 2020. It was on a pretty normal pattern compared with 2018, 2019, surprisingly. And for 2021, occupancy rates were actually well above any of the previous years until the lockdowns hit. And that's where we see the divergence of that trend line. So the good news is that demand definitely was there and occupancies were high. So we have no doubt that as soon as those lockdowns come out, I think the last I heard was like the 13th of October for the one in the folks in Sydney. So hopefully that will bring some of those occupancy rates up. Yeah, so the impact of the Delta variant. So the main way that we've seen this in the data has been an increase in cancellations. So it's not necessarily that people aren't willing to travel and aren't willing to book, but it definitely has made them kind of rethink their holiday. And particularly we're seeing, in conjunction with this, a shorter booking window now for travelers with all of these new variants. And here we see that in new bookings as well, right? With that booking lead time, that we've seen a massive reduction in that. So I think pre-pandemic, on average, the booking window was somewhere between 30 and 35 days for most locations. Now that's gone down to over 35% of bookings are happening within 7 days of the date of stay. So it's not to say that these bookings won't pick up, but definitely length of stay is booking lead time is impacting that. Yeah, so again, here's the kind of the big, I guess, the good news for those of you who are in more of these destination markets, and unfortunately some of the bad news for those of you who are in more urban destinations. It's most certainly a difference in the phenomenon of demand in different areas. So on the next slide, we'll go into exactly kind of what the breakdown is from most of the major tourism regions in Australia, but clearly, there's a lot more recovery happening in more non-urban destinations, so what we consider traditional destination markets, as opposed to some of the major urban markets, which prior to the pandemic were actually the driving force of short-term accommodation, particularly Airbnb. That's a platform that was doing particularly well in the urban markets. So if we look here, I know it's quite small, so I'll send this out after the call as well, so that anybody can take a closer look. But here we see that phenomenon really in representative statistics. So for example, one of the areas that's doing the best with over 100% growth year on year in demand is, well, over the last 2 years is Yorke Peninsula, followed closely by Kangaroo Island, so no surprise there. Whereas on the opposite end, you've got Sydney, Melbourne, Blue Mountains, still really struggling. In the case of Sydney, it's almost 75% down still from 2019 levels. And again, a lot of that is due to the types of visitors. So in most of these urban markets, we see much more international travelers, whereas in some of the more destination markets, domestic travel really has been a savior for them. And actually, we've seen a massive increase in demand there. It still remains to be seen what will happen when the borders open and people can go elsewhere. But at least for the last 2 years, it's been looking pretty good for many of these destination markets. Yeah, so I think a lot of you may have heard, oh, there's all these new listings coming up. It's looking really good. Here, what we're looking at is basically the net increase. So this green trend line you see here is looking at churn. So this is how many listings are removed each month that previously existed, minus the number of new listings. So when we normalize that, it's actually been pretty slow growing since about September, August of last year. That growth in new listings has really slowed down. Normally this is what we see whenever listing supply is trying to adjust for demand. So this kind of means that really the maximum demand has sort of been met. There's no real need for a true number of new properties or any more properties than were previously on the market. And this is something that we see sort of across the board throughout Australia. Yeah, so again, yeah, largest areas in losing this supply. And I know this is something I've chatted with many of you about, of some of these properties being put on, moving from short-term accommodation to long-term accommodation, particularly in the major urban markets. And again, it's just due to this lack of demand. So one of the, I guess, good things about short-term accommodation and why it's so important that you're tracking them is that supply is extremely elastic. So unlike a hotel where once it's built, the rooms are open, they're always open unless something happens. With short-term accommodation, that supply is so fluid that it can rise or fall to meet demand a bit more quickly. And so this is definitely something that we're seeing in the major urban centers, where as soon as that demand went away, the supply followed shortly thereafter. Pretty much listing growth. So the only areas that are seeing some sort of significant increase in the number of listings are sort of these mountain and coast destinations. So here you have some of the clear winners. So Capricorn is one of the major areas that's seen this growth, as well as Southern Queensland country. I don't know if Peter's here. I think he emailed me earlier saying he may not be able to make it, but if you're here, good shout to you, Peter. And yeah, the larger the home, the better the performance. So this goes back to what we were looking at on one of the first slides of the preference of travelers. So people are choosing short-term accommodation because it's a different way to travel. And so it gives them more flexibility to travel with family, to travel in groups. And definitely even more so throughout the pandemic, it's always been sort of an overarching trend in short-term accommodation. But in the pandemic, this was really accelerated. So properties that are larger, the better they're performing in terms of the demand for those properties. And people are actually willing to pay much higher rates for these larger properties post-pandemic than they were pre-pandemic. So something to keep in mind of the different types of supply that you may have in your market. Yeah. Again, so yeah, when we look globally, these are some of the top countries globally that we've examined. Still, that recovery is not picking up maybe as quickly as many of us would like. A lot of this is still due to travel restrictions. You know, if we look, the main areas that haven't seen this are places like the United States, where they have a massive domestic market. Germany as well has been quite lax in many of the restrictions post-COVID, and Mexico, I think, is at least here in Europe, it's kind of well known as being like where the COVID doesn't exist, even though it does. So there's very few restrictions for entry and once you arrive in destination for going out, and hardly any lockdowns and things like that. So in this instance, Australia definitely still lagging behind in terms of nights booked. For September, from August to October, so for this last quarter, but definitely there's some areas that are still doing worse. So there's a long way to go, and again, the opening of those borders will really have an impact on this increase in demand. Yeah, and again, yeah, lead time. So I know we mentioned this briefly, but if we look across the board here, 2021, even for many of these destination markets. Previously, those booking lead times were well high. And again, this is indicating the number of international travelers. So if you're coming from another country, you're much more likely to book farther in advance than if you're a domestic traveler. And so this is one of the main reasons that we're seeing some of these trends. It was looking fairly normalized until some of the lockdowns hit. So there is hope that some of that will pick back up, but for now, they're still well below what normal levels would be. And again, so we've still got some weak demand heading into spring for Australia. A lot of this we're hoping is mainly due again to the lockdowns and to the lack of the opening of the international borders. So we do think that once that's remedied, these will pick up. But as it stands now, that demand is definitely still far down for the next few months. So yeah, again, I'm sure Colin will kind of go into a little bit deeper, but I did want to share with you guys kind of how we help many of the DMOs with this type of information. You may be thinking, well, this is great, but how do I put that into action? And so here's some of the ways that many of our clients are using this information. Obviously, keeping track of supply and demand, being able to look more granularly at seasonality, as well as whenever you go to stakeholders, really being that voice of authority. Understanding what's really going on in your market, not just for traditional accommodation, but for short-term accommodation, and what the overall landscape is. Of course, marketing campaigns, which I know Colin will talk more about specifically, as well as tax revenue, which is some place that I think, particularly in Australia, there's a lot of headways to be made. It's something that we see quite often in markets in the US, where there's an occupancy tax collected not only on hotels, but also on short-term accommodation, and that in turn can be reinvested into the local economy. So this is something that I know Colin's a big fan of, and I'm sure he'll go on about a little bit. But yeah, I do want to encourage you all to kind of band together and look at that a little bit more closely, because it can definitely be an interesting source. And here's just a brief overview of some of the reports. I think many of you on the call today are other clients, or we've had a conversation before, so I won't bore you with too much of this. But we do track trends both historically as well as forward-looking. to really help you make the most out of your destination marketing, as well as planning from an economic development perspective, and as DMOs. And then here's all of the contacts, as well as my contact details. Again, I'll send this through to you guys after the call. So I guess if I might open it up for questions, or we can hand it over to Colin, whatever you think, Liv.
There we go. I think just because we're a bit conscious of time, I'm not sure how everyone, I mean, we're happy to sort of extend 10 minutes, obviously, because we're a bit delayed in the beginning. But hey, why don't we jump into Colin? And again, obviously, if anyone's got any questions, please feel free just to send them through as we go. But then once Colin's done as well with his presentation, we'll have a proper sort of Q&A session then as well. So Colin, I will hand over to you.
Okay, very good. Well, I don't sort of have a presentation as such, but what I thought it might sort of give you some ideas about what's been happening in our little part of the world. And I'm from Queensland, obviously, and you know, things are a little bit different in the tourism market than to the other states, for sure. But again, it's Queensland's a big country, Australia's a big country. Basically, what's happening around here is that, you know, we're getting a lot more. Again, shorter lead time is definitely the case, except for the peak times, Christmas and so on. People still booking well out, but the lead times plummeted, and so in many cases it's under 14 days for us, which is quite amazing because it's usually 70, 80. You know, we're happy if we got it under 70 days lead time. So from someone who's, you know, using this data to try and set tariffs in advance, well, you know, you're not working as far in advance as normal, for sure. I think it's also that area of sort of 2 to 3 hours drive. It's a drive market around from where we are, and which is right next door to Brisbane, and there's 4.5 million people that live in the southeast corner. For our little island, over 80% of people come from Brisbane in that 2 to 3 hour drive away, and that, you know, that's not changing. We're still getting the vast majority of our people from Brisbane. We've got no international tourists, obviously. It's a little, we're not quite sure exactly what the percentage of international tourists was. It was somewhere between 10 and 20%. I did see some data a little while ago that said there was about 12% of people who visited Straddie had booked on Airbnb using a .co.uk account or a non.com.au account. So, you know, that's interesting. Anyway, they're not here, but that's the room that they've created has more than been backfilled by the domestic market. So much so, there's some interesting things going on. We've had around about a 20% drop in listings available for rent, which is a lot, isn't it? You know, it's 500 down to 400, which means there's the less supply, demand's increased, and with that comes an increase in tariffs of somewhere around 20 to 30%, depending on the properties and the manager. Some people haven't changed their pricing at all. They're leaving things on the table, and they're probably people who don't have access to the sort of data that AirDNA can provide you. I love it. I think it's an amazing thing. I'm so pleased that I found it. I have 2 different subscriptions, one for my business as a holiday rental manager. And so there's dynamic pricing now built into that. So we can see, you know, the median price of properties, what's available on a particular date, what's not available, and what the price has been booked at, and so on. So we can get a really good idea, especially with this shorter lead time. You need to be all over that because it is still really price driven. Even though the prices are higher, you need to be on top of you know, what's available and what your competition is. And then the other subscription that I have access to, and all the members of the Chamber of Commerce have access to, is the DMO subscription, which is what I guess you guys are being sold to. That is a fabulous piece of data set. What it gives you the ability to see what's going on in your market, but also compare up to, I think it's 10 competitive markets. So in our case, at North Stradbroke Island, or our competitors are the Gold Coast, the Sunshine Coast, from that drive market. the 2-hour drive market, and then south of the border here, a well-known place called Byron Bay. And we also throw into our comp set a number of other islands. Kangaroo Island, and that was mentioned just before, they've had a big boom down there. So we can compare what's happening in terms of occupancy and RevPAR and average daily rate and so on over the years to our market. And the island here is doing really well. We've only got sort of 400 and something properties that are being marketed at the moment, and Byron Bay's got 4,000 or something. But yeah, it's remarkable how the occupancy has increased, the average daily rate has also increased, and so RevPAR's gone through the roof. So it's good business, either managing or owning short-term rental properties at the moment in our market. There are others in perhaps the Hunter Valley and further north in Queensland and Port Douglas and so on, who are a long way away or in total shutdown, who are really struggling. So it's a tale of luck, really. Well, our politicians would say that they've kept COVID at bay, but we've all just been pretty lucky, I'd say. How do I use AirDNA? Well, I think we work very closely with a wonderful tourism crew at the Redlands City Council. We're part of what's known as Redlands Coast, which is between the Sunshine Coast and the Gold Coast. It's the AirDNA data is not just the be all and end all. It needs to be looked at in a marketing sense. It's your results, but you also need to, in terms of you're either looking at adjusting your tariffs at a business owner level, or you're looking at your own marketing or the LGA marketing. So you're looking at, you must have some sort of plan as to what the marketing is going to achieve. So if it's destination marketing, okay, well, it's brand recognition and all that sort of thing, but how do you actually measure that? Well, I would argue that you measure that by the number of people, you run a campaign, the number of people who are going to Google and put in Stradbroke Island accommodation or things to do on Stratty or whatever the search term has to be, and then your DMO website needs to be high ranking right there, and people can. So you're measuring entrances to your website and perhaps exits to the members of your website's operator sites and that sort of thing, to measure how an advertising campaign works. So destination marketing is not about tactical, buy stay 3, pay 2, or get a free bag of fish and chips when you come to Stradbroke Island. Destinations marketing is about the sort of image that's behind me right now, and creating some sort of attachment for people, and whether they're coming for the first time or whether they're not. Now, I was just looking at my website analytics in the last 3 weeks. 80% of people who've been to my website have never been there before, and that is extraordinary, because 18 months ago, 80% of the people that came to my website were previous customers, or at least researched on my site in some time before that. So there's a bit of a difference. I think people in Southeast Queensland are going, okay, what are we going to do? And they'd never really thought about Stradbroke Island before. Maybe they went to Noosa, or they went to Byron Bay, and they just did that a month ago on the weekend away with their mates. They went and rented a 5-bedroom house. Now they've done Noosa, they've done Byron Bay. They're, oh well, let's go to Stratty and have a look there. And that's certainly what's happening. People are they're new customers. We're meeting a lot of new people. The lead times drastically dropped, but interestingly for us, the length of stay has increased. So at this time of year, our market is really sort of in Friday, out Monday, or Sunday night. We're finding now that Thursday is our in the off season is our biggest arrival day. So people are taking that extra day. How are they managing to do that? Well, I think there's a bit of a work from home thing going on there. So on Fridays you have you can do. Oh, I'm going to work from home on Friday. I'll go to Stratty on Thursday night. Perhaps I'll go for a swim in the morning. Then I'll do a few hours using the high-speed internet that's available, and then the kids will come over after school, and then we'll spend the weekend here. So that's interesting. It has implications, all sorts of implications, but so it's not just the lead time, is it? There's a whole lot of other changes in the way the consumer is operating. I just wonder, the question is how permanent is this? Is this the new normal? I think it probably is, but time will tell, I suppose. That's a bit of a rave. There you go.
We were chatting earlier before we kind of got started about tax revenue and how this is obviously a concept that's it's quite well established, particularly in the US markets and some of the European markets, where there is an occupancy tax being collected not only on hotels but also on short-term accommodation. And I know you're definitely a fan of this and being able to invest it back into the local economy. I think we've seen that it tends to bring up the standard of many other properties that are being offered, which in turn brings up the standard of the destination as a whole. And then also, some of the benefits there for the local economy. I'd love to kind of get your perspective on what you think some of the challenges are in implementing that kind of legislation, and why you think it's not really taken hold yet in Australia, and kind of, would love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think politically it's really difficult. There's no mayor in a local government area that wants to, or anywhere, in any politician who wants to increase taxes. So if you're going to do something like that, you've really got to couch that in a different way. Look, the reality is, I'm a big believer that local government, and state government, and Australian governments, federal government should be carrying the can for marketing, and they should be. They've got destinations and so on, but the reality is that, particularly now, there's not so much money flowing around in governments and so on. So there needs to be alternative ways to fund marketing. There needs to be alternative ways to fund little organisations like chambers of commerce as well. Not just the membership fee. Maybe there's another mechanism to the bigger you are, the more you pay kind of idea. But certainly, there's especially with the advent of short-term rentals, if someone's bought a house, they're renting it out, they're managing it themselves on Airbnb maybe. According to the latest data I saw, only 25% of properties are actually owner managers on Airbnb. So that 75% of them are managed by property managers. Most of them are real estate agents in Australia. So there's marketing being done either at a destination DMO level or by those businesses like mine. And the guy with his own house up the top of the hill here, who puts it on Airbnb, is sort of getting a free ride, really. We're doing the marketing for them, and they get the benefit. So the challenge there is, how do you bring those people inside the tent? And one of the ways you could do that would be to have some sort of an increase in the $500 levy if you don't live in your house in the tourism area. So you're renting it out, then maybe it's $500, or maybe it's whatever it is, attached to your rates. That money then goes into the DMO, and the Redland City Council would then, and the tourism unit would then create marketing campaigns. So it's like a closed loop, and everyone's contributing and everyone's getting a benefit. I think that's a good way of doing it. There aren't too many politicians that think that's a great idea. The mayor's not really keen on that idea. But I think it's inevitable. That's the way it's got to go. Yeah.
And as well, I know a lot of the marketing sometimes, particularly in Australia, it's done more at a higher level or destination, sometimes even the state level. And we were mentioning briefly of kind of how that impacts smaller destinations. What do you think the benefit to individual LGAs or even smaller destination marketing organizations is to having access to this type of data and really kind of owning their own marketing alongside what's going on at the destination level?
Yeah, well, so our data, we've got a big island, or a small island, but second biggest sand island in the world. We've got 3 townships, and the rest of it's national park. Those townships are pretty small. There's just over 2,000 people that live between the 3 of them. 2 of them are more tourism, there's Airbnbs, short-term rentals, and there's a lot more in the bigger town at Dunwich or Gympie that's where more permanent people live. So we can see so we can see that, for instance, that Amity is a little town, little fishing village. It's not full of luxury houses. It's got little fishing shacks and this sort of thing. It's got a lot of them. It's a totally different experience to Point Lookout, where my business is. But we can look at occupancy there, average daily rate, and see what's happening in Amity. We can see, so in theory you can do a some destination marketing for a destination within a destination. For Redlands Coast, though, the Redlands City, I think, I can't remember the number, there's about 15 or something islands in Moreton Bay, and Stratty's the jewel in the crown, but there are many other smaller islands that have a different product offering and so on. So it's very difficult for the city's marketers to try and destination market the Redlands Coast and drive some sort of visitation into Coochie-Mudlow Island. With this sort of data, you can, I believe, you can look at, because you can get granular right down into what's happening on Coochie-Mudlow Island, what was the occupancy like. You can run a specific campaign just for a segment. And this is the hard bit for destination DMOs, I think. They're usually big areas with lots of different product, and how do you market something like that other than a scattergun? So you've got bus stops with, here's someone kayaking somewhere, here's someone eating somewhere, here's a beach somewhere. You really need to get your focus on what you're trying to achieve, and this sort of, and again, it's got to be measurable. You've got to work out how to measure it, and I think that's where the AirDNA data comes in really handy. That and your Google Analytics. Are you driving people to your website? If you are, well, then that's probably job done.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we have many clients as well using it as sort of a way to focus some of their efforts. So, as you mentioned, maybe they're marketing and there's 15 different smaller islands or mini destinations or LGAs within that area. If they do have that breakdown through the AirDNA data, where they can see, hey, this area is already at 75, 80% occupancy. Some of these others were still at 20%. These are the areas we're going to focus on really heavily to make sure that everything's kind of a little bit more equitable across the destination, and they're spreading out that tourism. I think that's one of the things that we learned that maybe the pandemic has given us some pause for, is sort of this idea of over tourism and what that looks like and how to have more of a sustainable tourism environment moving forward. And I think definitely being able to break that down by individual LGAs or even smaller areas within each of the destinations, can help us do that.
Indeed. That whole discussion about sustainable tourism and what it is and is a really interesting one that we're sort of beginning to have here. A lot of people talk about sustainable tourism. Not many people really have got a handle on what it means. And it might mean different things to different people. And first thing really is to get some sort of agreement as a group or as a destination or a sub-destination about what that means for the local people. And this whole idea of live like a local. I'm not sure all the people really want to live like a local. They just want to be treated like one. And if they're not, well, then the tourism offering isn't sustainable. It's more than just people, planet, profit. I think it's a fascinating discussion when there is an opportunity to reset, and people are really, they're booking later, they're staying longer, they're paying more, everything's new, and so nothing should be off the table, and the sustainability discussion should be right at the top for sure. And it kind of is here. We're moving in that direction. I hope Luke from the Redlands City Council's here listening, but there is a community-led discussion about that, so a bottom-up rather than top-down, and that seems to be the way. You've got to bring the community along with you, whatever it is, and people need to have some sort of agreement or on a direction and what is sustainable. For in some destinations, sustainable means buses and concrete and shopping, and others it means self-drive or walking or low key, blue water, white sand, chips and gravy, which is the way we see our market. Family destination, back to the old school holiday, family holiday, and that's certainly what's going on. people are taking more time together as a family or as a friends group and so on, and promote what you've got, which is real from the heart kind of thing.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, another thing that we kind of one of the common themes, I guess, that we see when we speak with particularly LGAs and sort of economic development agencies across Australia, there's a lot of people kind of that have members come to them and say, hey, what are we going to do about Airbnb? We have an affordable housing crisis here. And I think in a lot of cases, COVID has sort of accelerated that in maybe some smaller LGAs where already there wasn't a lot of housing to begin with. There's been a massive influx in people wanting to visit these areas because they are a bit more remote. Ironically, in several cases, and clients have received our data to say, hey, how many actual short-term rentals are there? And they've seen a similar phenomenon to you, Colin, where maybe previously they had more short-term rental listings, and post-pandemic they have even less. So it kind of proves the opposite of what a lot of the conjecture is, that this is all related to short-term rentals. And again, if you're looking at it from an economic development perspective, that's an important distinction, because if you think it's all about short-term rentals and they're kind of the bad guy and that's what you go after legislating, what you realize is, no, actually we have a real housing shortage that has nothing to do with short-term accommodation. It has nothing to do with tourism, and it's a different way that you would approach that solution to that. So I don't know if this is something that you personally have experienced in your destination, or if you know of anyone else in your region that's had something similar happen.
Well, certainly, there's been a real estate boom. There's been more property sold in the last 12 months on Strategy than pretty much the last 5 years, and we're finding, along with those changes in behaviour of booking lead times and lengths of stay and that sort of thing, we're also finding that owners are using their properties for a lot more. In my little business, it used to be about 10-12% of bookings were owner bookings. Now it's 24-25. It's doubled, which is good. It's good if you're a fish and chip shop owner, because the owners are using their properties more often. So there's a bit more custom around during the week when the tourists aren't here so much in the low season. But it also puts a lot of pressure on accommodation for staff. These are people whose houses they used to rent out permanently, perhaps, and they weren't quite up to the standard of for a holiday rental. But now, instead of renting them out on a permanent basis, then they're using them themselves. A lot of these houses have been bought now by people who are just going to use them all the time, and they just go backwards and forwards. So they're not even in the short-term rental market. That's where the 500 down to 400 occurred. It's a structural change. When you consider, the lead time and length of stay and the number of available properties, and there's all this amazing stuff going on. And the question is, how long is it going to last for? And is this the new normal? And it's my view, it's the new normal from the people I'm talking to. Will our sort of increase in pricing and so on continue for another year and another year and another year? Well, we'll see. Depends how much demand is exceeding supply. At the moment, it's massively supply is exceeding demand, and if 20% of them are going to go and start travelling overseas, I think we're still in a inverted sort of area where demand's still going to be high. We've got the big houses. We're close to Brisbane. Pretty bullish about the business side of demand over here. Certainly, it's the sustainability side that we really need to be looking at. We really have to now. It's something we've all talked about for a few years, but nothing's really got going. And now, sustainability is what it's all about. I think that's me. My view, humble.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just being conscious of the time, I think we've got about 7 minutes left. So I think maybe we'll open it up if there's any questions for myself or Olivia or Colin, or anything specific on the data. And if there's anything, Colin, that we haven't asked you that you wish we would have asked you, or that you want to use this platform, Colin.
I guess thinking aloud. I think there's, as I've kind of been saying, there's a really big opportunity. One of the things about this data is that, like, I'm in a small market. We have 4 or 5 little resorts, and they're not resorts as a European would know them. They're really apartment blocks. They're probably, I think there's 60 or 70 of them, and there's somewhere between 400 and 500 short-term rentals. And I actually I was watching a webinar a little while ago, and there was a guy from Germany, and I can't remember the businesses that they were representing, but it was really interesting. This guy who was the big statistics man, and he was what he said was, you know, in a small market where people aren't being that, businesses aren't being that scientific about how they're setting their prices, and certainly not using dynamic pricing. But the data's not that strong. It can't be really relied on, because, you know, you look like you're charging a lot more than others, because these people aren't being dynamic. You know, because the industry's not as professionally run as it could be. This is Airbnb, privateers, and so on. You need to be, you know, the rising tide floats all boats. You've got to have data. And from the Chamber of Commerce's point of view, we try and make that data available to all our members in the accommodations sphere, and hopefully they're looking at what the average daily rate was, what the occupancy is, comparing it to their own thing, and going, oh, hang on. From a DMO's point of view, you know, that creates opportunities to help people to run their businesses better, to teach them about dynamic pricing. But you've got to have the data to start with. And when I say the rising tide floats all boats, you know, that lady down the road with her little Airbnb, or maybe she's got 2 of them, or something, probably could do with you know, she does a wonderful job. The beds are beautifully made, and the amenities and everything are there, but she's underselling it by a long way. And you know, I think the DMOs and for us, the Chamber of Commerce, we try to work with our members, if they want to try and give them a hand, you know, and look at the traffic going to your website. Hey, you've got all this traffic going to your website from our website, but they're not booking. So, you know, let's have a look at your website. What's wrong with it? Is the booking, is it clunky? Is it old? Is your booking engine rubbish and people just bailing out? Help people create a better experience for guests, but you need data to measure. That's my view.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this kind of collaborative effort as well is something in destinations that are performing quite well. We see this as really one of the keys to success is, you know, and part of that is just bringing them into that hemisphere, as you were mentioning, of, hey, like, we're promoting you guys, help us help you. We want you to have more bookings. We want people to stay longer overnights. We want your website to look really good when people get to it, you know, and really making it a lot more collaborative, and realizing that, you know, short-term accommodation is part of the visitor economy. It's not going anywhere. If anything, the demand for it is only getting stronger. And so, you know, figuring out how to kind of implement that and be more collaborative. But as you say, if you don't have access to the data and you don't really even know the scale of that market, then it's difficult to kind of put a focus on that and allocate resources to building those relationships.
Yep. Agree.
Well, everybody, I think we're almost at the end of time here. So yeah, if there's any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat box or email us afterwards. We'll also be sending out a copy of the slide deck that I shared on sort of the state of affairs in Australian short-term rentals as of Q3. And then we'll also be sending out a recording that we've been recording the webinar, so we'll send that out. Oh yeah, we've got a nice little shout out from Zach. Awesome, yeah. Thanks so much, Colin, for your comments. I think everybody has really enjoyed it. We very much appreciate you joining us. It definitely wouldn't have been the same without you. And it's always nice to have kind of your perspective on things, because we're kind of boring and stuck in the data all day. And so you give us some real world examples of how it's useful and kind of how it's impacted your business.
Cool.
So thanks again for joining us. And yeah, I think that's it. As I said, if anybody has any other questions, yeah, feel free to email us, and we'll be sending out the slide deck as well, so you'll have our contact details. And thanks for joining us.
Great.
Thank you, everyone.
It's been a pleasure. Ciao.
Bye.